All right. So what I want to talk about right now is the different type of shape formats or object formats in Adobe Animate, because you have to understand there are different properties or different types that your characters, your elements can be, and they will change how they work depending on what they are. Okay. So I'm going to go to Adobe Illustrator. If you've never worked with Adobe Illustrator, it's okay. You don't need to know anything about Adobe Illustrator. The only reason I'm showing it to you is that both Adobe Illustrator and Adobe Animate are both vector-based for drawing. Okay. Now, Adobe Illustrator, I have one shape, I have two paths. And if I take one path and I overlap it, they stay separate from each other. Okay. These two shapes will never defaultly connect with each other. Okay. The way Animate, though, works is a little different. So if I was to draw a rectangle or even use the basic, drawing tool here, what I've done is I've created something called a shape. Okay. How can you tell if what you drew is a shape? Well, if you highlight it and you go to your properties panel and you go to the right corner, it'll tell you what format your object is in. And this is a shape format. This is also a shape format. This is a shape format, and this is a shape format. The thing about shape formats is that if you take two shape formats that are the same color, so for instance, these are both red, and you overlap them, and then you deselect or click away, and then you go back and highlight them, they automatically merge with each other. Okay, so before these were two separate shapes. Now these are automatically combined. Okay, it's kind of a little bit like the Pathfinder tool in Adobe Illustrator, if you're familiar with that. So just be aware that if you have two objects that are considered shape and they are the same color, they will automatically merge once they're overlapped with each other. Okay. That does not happen in other vector-based programs like Adobe Illustrator. Even though these are the same color and I, overlap them and such, they will never defaultly, merge with each other. Okay. If they're two different colors, let's say I take this and I overlap this purple circle here, and then I highlight it and move it, this actually subtracted from this shape. Okay. So if you overlap shapes of different colors, they will automatically actually subtract from the other shape. Okay. Once again, this does not happen in a program like Adobe Illustrator, where these will never, add or subtract to each other regardless of color or how they're placed. Okay. Another thing is there's something called a primitive. Okay. See where it says rectangle primitive, oval primitive. So typically you have to start off building a primitive. I'm going to create a primitive here, and I'm just going to give it like a light fill color and a darker stroke color. Okay. I'm just going to click and drag, and let's make the stroke a little thicker. Now, the thing about a primitive, and by the way, how can you tell that this is a primitive? Good question. Well, if you highlight it, it'll say the word primitive here instead of shape. Okay, so this is an oval primitive. This is a rectangular primitive. Okay. What's the difference between a rectangle primitive and a shape? Glad you asked. Well, if you make a normal, I'm going to draw this. Now they look the same, but this is considered a, whoops. Let me try that again. Let's see what it's trying to do. Okay. Even though these are the same colors, this is considered, why is it not? Sorry, it's automatically creating objects for me. Of course, I don't want it to do it in one time. It's trying to do it. Okay. I don't know why I was defaulting to a primitive to an object. We'll talk about that. But anyway, so this is a primitive. This is a shape. Okay. It has to, so even though they kind of look the same, they don't work the same. If something is a shape, the fill and the stroke are not attached. So you can see I can separate the fill from the stroke. Okay. Also, shapes will subtract from each other. A primitive kind of works more like an object in Illustrator. So in Illustrator, when you have a fill and a stroke, I'm going to add a stroke here. The fill and the stroke are defaultly always attached to each other. Most vector programs typically work that way. Okay. So a primitive in Adobe Animate is kind of closer to the way a vector would work in Adobe Illustrator. Also, in Adobe Illustrator, vectors don't subtract from each other or add to each other. So if something is a primitive here, this primitive will never interact with other items because that's not how primitives work. Okay. If you want to make something into a primitive that's not currently a primitive, let's say I wanted this. So right now, these are both shapes. If I wanted to convert this to a primitive, I could go to modify, combine objects union. And when I do that, that would actually turn it into a drawing object, which we'll talk about. Okay. So the point of this is really about objects interacting with each other. Currently, these are shapes. Okay. And typically, if you take two shapes, they will combine, right? Well, another thing you could do if you didn't want your objects to combine would be highlighting multiple objects and putting them in a group. Groups in general are handy when you want to combine multiple items together. But if something is within a group, things in groups do not merge or subtract from other items, even if the objects in the group are shapes. Okay, so normally these are shapes, they would combine, but I can make these into a group by going to modify group or Command or Control G. When you look at this, you can tell this is a group because there's a little light blue border around it. It also says the word group here under properties. Notice that these do not merge or subtract from anything, even though now once, if you want to ungroup them, take a group, ungroup, now they go back, and now these would add and subtract from each other. Same thing here, I'll take these. Now normally these would combine with each other, but I'm going to merge these. And you can see that as a group, they do not connect with each other, okay? So shapes automatically merge and subtract depending on color. Primitives and groups do not, okay? couple other ways you can not have things automatically merge is by using layers. Okay. During the semester, we're going to be using layers a lot to have more complex compositions. But for instance, right now I have a square layer on top and I have a circle layer underneath it. So if you want to make a layer in Adobe Animate, you would click on this little plus sign in the left corner. That makes a new layer. You can give it a name. Keep in mind that all layers in Animate cannot have spaces in them. So you have to use like an underscore or something like that. So I'm just going to call this, I don't know, triangle. Okay. The moment this layer is empty, but I'm just going to draw a triangle by using the classic brush and just, draw like a shape like that. And let's fill it with the paint bucket. Okay. So I have a triangle layer, a square layer, and a circle layer. Just a little bit about layers. First of all, this is your layer stack, and it goes from the bottom up. So in this case, the circle layer is on the bottom, the square layer is on top of it, and then the triangle layer is on top of that. Think of it like a sandwich where it's bread, meat, cheese. Excuse me. At any point, if you want to reorder your layers, you can always do that. Take a layer, click and drag it. Hopefully you can see that little black line. That black line represents that I'm changing the stack order. So if I put the circle on the top, now it is in front of everything else, and it's actually blocking the items behind it. I can take and move it down a slot. Now it's between the triangle and the square, or I can take this layer and drag it down. Okay. So this is what's called my layer stack. Another thing you can do is just this little eye icon. This is called the visibility toggle. And if you click on it, you get a little eye with a slash through it. That means that that particular layer has been turned off. Why would you want to turn off a layer? Well, sometimes you want to see what your design looks like without certain content. So we can turn off layers just to temporarily remove an item or make it invisible temporarily. If something is turned off, there'll be this little icon here. Click back on it to toggle it back on. Okay. On this far right, there's this thing called a lock, which literally looks like an old-fashioned padlock. If a layer is locked, that means you cannot alter it. That means you cannot do things like using eraser tools or moving stuff around or drawing onto it. So for instance, let's say I have this square layer. I don't want to accidentally move or subtract anything, so I might lock that layer. If I try to do anything, see how I can't actually edit that particular layer? Same with this triangle. I can't click and highlight the triangle because that particular layer is locked. Once you unlock it, then I can highlight and make changes to that particular layer. Okay. Finally, there's this outline button. What this would do is show your graphic as an outline as opposed to a flush item. Sometimes people like looking at outlines just to, quickly look at the layout. These are the colors they'll be displayed as. So this is blue, yellow, purple. So if I click on this, this is blue, this is yellow, and then this is purple. If you want to change the color, double click, and you can go within the layer. This is also a place where you can lock and unlock and rename layers, by the way. This is also where you can change the outline color. So if I wanted to change it to red, I could do that. And so now when I put it in outline mode, it's going to be red as opposed to the original blue. Typically, you don't, I find that these are not really that necessary, but a lot of times people accidentally click them and you might wonder what happened. That's just outline mode. Just turn it back on by clicking back on this object. Another thing you can do is what's called soloing a layer. Oops, that's not soloing. If you want to delete a layer, by the way, you can also highlight a layer, delete. That would remove a layer. You can also organize them by making folders to group them. So if I wanted to make a folder and say shapes, I could then take these layers, drag them into the folder. The reason why you might want to do this is, one, it lets you move, if you highlight the whole, it lets you work with them as a group. So for instance, you could lock things together in one or turn them all off and on. So it just makes kind of like grouping things a little bit easier for you. Going back to the purpose of why we might want to separate layers out. So if something is a shape, so notice that this is a shape, and notice also that the square is a shape and that the circle is a shape. Even though they're all shapes, because they're on different layers, notice that they do not merge with one another. Okay. Let's talk about something called a drawing object. So primitives don't merge, groups don't merge, layers do not merge. Now we have something called a drawing object. What is a drawing object? Well, I'm going to click on this classic brush, and let's make this a little bit bigger. There's my fill, right? And if I was to draw it again, because they're actually the same color and they're both defaultly a shape, they're going to merge with each other. See that? Let me do one more time. And they all merge with each other. What if I didn't want that to happen? What if I wanted my strokes, even though they're on top of each other, to stay independent of each other? And I didn't want to make them, put them on separate layers, because that would be, if I have a lot of strokes, that can be kind of a pain. What you could do is, for a lot of tools, there's this object, or there's an option called an object drawing. It looks like a little circle inside of a square, okay? You'll see that for things like the brushes and for the pen tool and for the shapes, I believe, maybe not the shapes, but the pen tool. I guess the shapes have it too. They all have this option, right? And you can also actually get it from here. I'm going to click on drawing object mode. Okay. And now I'm going to draw something just like I did before. So I'm going to draw, and then when I let go and I highlight this, see how it says drawing object? And see how there's kind of like that little group box around it, kind of like when we saw groups. I'm going to draw again. So these are two drawing objects. And the thing about drawing objects is drawing objects, like groups, don't merge with things. Okay. So see, even though these were both drawn, they are drawing objects. Drawing objects do not merge with other items, no matter whether they are the, same color or not. Okay. If you don't want things to be a drawing object when you draw, just turn it off. And then now when I draw, these should be shapes, and they should merge with each other or subtract from each other if they were different colors. All right. Okay, so drawing objects are nice because they don't, you can draw, but they don't automatically merge with one another. There's a problem with that. Okay, what's the problem? Well, right now, each of my lines here, I drew using this. I drew it as a drawing object. Okay. Now, they look like they're connected. It looks like a triangle, right? And so you think I could come in with the paint bucket tool and fill it in, but it's not going to let me do it. Even with, close large gaps, it's not going to let me do that. Why is it not going to let me do that? Well, because each time you draw and let go, every object became its own independent object. And so this line and this line, even though they're next to each other, because they're independent objects, they don't merge with each other. Okay. So because they don't merge, they'll never fully be a closed shape, which means I'll never be able to fill it. Okay. So there are going to be times that you want to convert a primitive back into a shape, or a group back into a bunch of shapes, or a drawing object into a bunch of shapes. So I'm going to do that. Let's use the brush tool, and I'm going to make this a drawing object. This should be a drawing object. Okay. And I'll just draw another one. That's a drawing object. To convert a drawing object back into a shape, what you could do is go to modify, break apart, or Command or Control B. By doing that, it's going to convert this back into a shape. So when I click on this, you'll see how it says shape. I'm going to click on this one, which is also a drawing object. Let's break that apart back into a shape. And so now, because both of these are shapes, if I lap them, they should merge with each other. How does that relate to this? Well, what I'm going to do is take all three of these, the drawing objects, and break them apart back into shapes. Because they're all the same color, they're all black, they're all going to merge with each other and form a closed path, or a closed shape, or a triangle. Okay. Now that I've done that, I should be able to come in and fill it in. Okay. So just be aware that if you're going to use these like a primitive or a drawing object, that they're not going to merge with each other, and that may affect your ability to fill them. Okay, so just be aware. It's kind of, and by the way, if you want to go back, right now I have this triangle with a stroke around it. If you wanted to, you could convert a shape into a drawing object by doing that combined objects union. So that took a shape and converted it to a drawing object. So you can take a drawing object, convert it to a shape, or a shape and convert it to a drawing object. All right, so just kind of a quick kind of review. So these are both shapes of different colors. Subtract when you overlap them and move them. Shapes of the same color will merge. If things are groups, even if groups will never merge with anything else, things that are drawing objects will never merge or subtract from anything else, and primitives will never merge and combine with other things. If you want to take any of these and make them back into a shape, you could do that. So if I take this group, I can break a group apart that breaks them back into shapes. And if I do this, see how it's subtracted from it? Okay. If I take this, which is a drawing object, I can break it apart into a shape. That subtracts. Or I could take this primitive and break it apart. Because now they're both shapes, they will subtract from each other. Okay. So try that out. That was 15 through 21.